Look, last night you recall the first inkling we got about the impending resignation of Daniel Andrews came from comments made by Eddie Maguire, the TV host, to a packed room at Crown Casino where he was emceeing the Carbine Club's famous AFL Grand Final week lunch. Now, friends of mine were in the room yesterday. They said the response to the news from Maguire was rapturous applause. We've now got some audio to play you. Have a listen.
Premier of Victoria, Daniel Andrews, will step down as Premier of Victoria. So we'll have a new Premier on Saturday, Brian, and a new Premier. Maybe the Governor knows something we haven't been told, but I believe that'll happen in the next 10 minutes' time. So we'll find out in due course.
Now, that's the same room who last year and every other year would have been fawning at the mention of the Premier's name. Let's bring Greg Sheridan now, foreign editor, of course, at The Australian. Greg, we'll get into some other issues, but I know you're a long-time Victorian and you're pretty shrewd on your politics. A lot of ink and commentary today about Andrews and his legacy and I think more broadly, his national influence in Labor politics, given a lot of the hard left agenda in Victoria was put in place and then often imported into other jurisdictions by Labor premiers. Give us your assessment of a man who, you just heard that audio now, roundly disliked, even inside Labor, divisive with voters, yet is won 3 elections, Premier for 9 years, and he departs tonight at 5 o'clock at a time of his own choosing, which is rare in politics.
Well, Peter, wonderful to be with you. So a couple of things to say very briefly about Dan Andrews. The first is, this is kind of contra-intuitive really. Oddly enough, I had some quite extensive private dealings with him a few years back, not on a political matter. And I must say I found him courteous, professional, across all the detail of everything, absolutely in command of his government and very good company. So there's that side of Dan Andrews. Other people know that infinitely better than me, but let me just, from the enemy camp, so to speak, from the camp of Andrews' critics. Also, he was a brilliantly effective politician. I mean, I lived in Sydney through the Neville Wran and Bob Carr years. They were both dominant premiers, won a lot of elections, but I don't think I've ever seen a single man dominate a political space as much as Andrews. Now, having said all that, I think he was a very, very, very bad Premier for Victoria. And you can see that with the massive mountain of state debt that Victoria has. It's strangled fiscally from here to Timbuktu. It won't be able to do anything but pay off the debt. And the interest bill on the debt year by year will grow. He's also, I think, really diminished Victorian institutions. He wouldn't appear on mainstream radio programs because he didn't want to be subject to cross-examination by a well-informed person like yourself, say, Peter, who knew what was going on, but even on the ABC, even on the friendly ABC, instead of which he used the massive resources of government to know exactly how to channel social media to voters who were not much engaged in politics and get them to vote the right way. He suspended the Labor Party for a couple of years, so there wasn't even that limit on his power. He pretty much ignored the Parliament, didn't respond to all the ethical, charges brought against his government. He just dismissed all those. And I think he leaves Victoria nearly bankrupt, with severely damaged institutions and suffering all the mediocrity, massive cost overruns and political unhealthiness of a long one-party state. This is an unusual part of Australia in its political culture, and it's an unhealthy political culture, and that is a result of a decade of Dan.
Look, I have to say I agree with all of that, and I think that he's always been underestimated by his opponents, the Liberals. I think part of the reason for his success is that, but also that they've been extraordinarily weak themselves in combating him and taking him on. Now, let's hope that changes. I'll come back to that a bit later in the show, but I want to now move to this speech overnight in the US by Britain's Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. I mean, this was an extraordinary speech on every level. in and around the issue of multiculturalism, where she said it's dead. She said multiculturalism has failed. She took aim at the UN too. She says the laws in relation to refugees are out of date. They need reform. She even went so far as to say that Western countries are at risk of losing their culture if they don't demand drastic action. Have a listen.
Multiculturalism makes no demands of the incomer to integrate. It has failed because it allowed people to come to our society and live parallel lives in it. They could be in the society, but not of the society.
Greg, she is, of course, the daughter of Mauritian and Kenyan migrants to the UK. That point about people not integrating into Western society. Now, I'm not saying assimilate. This is integration, and you and I both know there's a difference there. She says if we keep this up, Western society will just disappear. What do you make of her comments?
Well, it's a very, very interesting speech indeed, Peter. Multiculturalism as a word has largely fallen into disuse in Australia. Oddly enough, partly I think because of the obsession with Indigenous issues, which has kind of been good for migrants because the ideological left has sort of left them alone. Whereas 20 or 30 years ago, all the identity politics projections of the left were foisted on our innocent migrants. I think, look, there's a lot of substance in what she says, but I think it's a mischaracterisation of most immigrants to Western societies. So the highest income, most successful group in the United States today are Indians. The group with the highest join-up rate into the American military are the Hispanics. Now, I think what has happened in Europe is that they've had a great deal of unregulated and essentially illegal or extra-legal immigration, uncontrolled immigration from North Africa and the Middle East. Now, I think that cohort of immigrants is extremely challenging for Europe. There's a brilliant book, The French Intifada, which just describes the absolute hatred of France that so much of the North African and Middle East Muslim cohort has who live in France. And so I think she's slightly wrong to sketch that her critique in terms of most immigrants into the West, but she is absolutely right. And here I think the fault is with the West, not with the immigrants. The loss of self-confidence and belief and fidelity to Western ideals. I mean, the reason I've written in favour of the no vote in the Voice referendum is because I believe that there should be no hierarchy of descent, that race shouldn't play any role in our civic life. Now, the fact that Western elites can't even bring themselves together on a simple proposition like that, which everyone would have agreed with 20 years ago, is a sign of our loss of self-confidence. But I think it's our fault more than the fault of the immigrants, really.
I will just back you in on that point, though. When I was speaking to a number of people, particularly a young Indian bloke who's campaigning in Western Sydney on the no side of the Voice campaign, he said some of the strongest supporters for his no position are the newly arrived migrants who said this is not what we signed up to. We signed up to a country where there is no hierarchy of descent. And that's, I think, the problem that the Yes campaign hasn't tackled head on. So we'll see what happens in a couple of weeks' time. Greg Sheridan, thank you for your time as always. See you next week.